Welcome to When We Die Talks. I'm your host, Zac Ancell. In this podcast, we explore different beliefs about what happens when we die and how those ideas shape the way we live. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by The Dead Book. Okay, let's get real for a second. How prepared are your parents, your siblings, your partner, or even you for the future? We're not talking about the fun stuff, but the hard stuff, end-of-life planning. It's a tough conversation, but that's why The Dead Book exists. The Dead Book makes it easy to plan ahead, even if you think you don't have the time, money, or assets. It's affordable, straightforward, and designed to give you and your loved ones peace of mind. They've made it their mission to help others avoid the chaos and stress that comes with being unprepared. Visit thedeadbook.co and get started today. And just for listening, use the code WWDT at checkout for 15% off. Hey everyone. In this episode, I sit down with Zac Phillips to explore an incredibly personal and transformative part of his life, the passing of his father and the journey that followed. Zac opens up about what it was like to be there during his dad's final days, sharing the emotional, physical, and even spiritual challenges he faced as he took on an active role in caring for his father. From preparing his dad's last meal to the deeply hands-on burial process, Zac experienced an intimacy with death that most of us never encounter. This conversation dives into the raw and often overlooked realities of grief, what it feels like, how it shapes us, and why so many of us struggle to talk about it. Zac also shares how his experience shifted his spiritual beliefs, how he continues to keep his father's memory alive, and why he believes grief is as much an expression of love as it is of loss. Zac's story is powerful, deeply human, and a reminder of just how important it is to embrace the conversations we tend to avoid. I hope you enjoy. I'm excited for this. We've had a couple good conversations, and I know this is a tough subject, tough topic to talk about. And so I appreciate you being willing to share and talk about your dad and your experience with that and everything.
Yeah, man. Honestly, I don't know if enjoy is the right word necessarily, but I get a sense of purpose and like meaning around talking about this, because I feel like it's something that like life would just be better if we were able to talk to each other about what was really going on. Because there's this behavior around death or like somebody who's grieving that, at least in my experience, where there's this like tiptoeing around. And even just like for me, it's like I actually enjoyed talking about my dad. Like, and yes, it was hard, and yes, it was sad, and yes, it still is sad. But to me, I feel like there's just a lot of fear in people's like approaches to it. Like people don't really know what to say.
Yeah.
You know, there's this tendency. I mean, I know what not to say, which is like, you know, people will try to minimize what you're going through and be like, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. And that kind of thing. And to me, that's almost like an insulting thing to say, because I feel like these things happen, whether or not it's for a reason or not. That's another podcast.
Yeah.
But it's an opportunity to grow and change. For me, it was really just change my entire spiritual beliefs, and also just how I looked at suffering in general. Like I was already, you know, you mentioned your experience, and there's like just times when life pulls us into these moments of like soul initiation.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, this isn't quite how I where I thought I would be. How the fuck did I get here?
Yeah.
And
ask myself a lot that.
And then you're kind of like forced to be like, okay, who am I? Like, how do I want to do things differently? Because the flip side to the structures of your life around you crumbling is that it just creates space for something else to be filled in.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I mean, I think about when I was 20 and the structures in my life at 20, it's like, hell no, I don't want to go back there. Like, much respect to myself then for
you're doing the best that you could,
doing what I thought, was the best. But yeah, just learning how to ride those waves of change. And for me, I was at a similar spot of like soul initiation. I mean, it was already 2020, first of all, and the whole pandemic. But I had also just gone through a divorce and was navigating like being single dad and just like that whole, also just society being like
in
totally
a weird place.
In a weird place. And yeah, but that was definitely, and I lost my job also on top of that. So it was like, okay, luckily earlier on in the year, I had read this book, When Things Fall Apart by Pima Chadron.
Yeah.
And there's this.
I read that this year, so it must be one of those things that like just like shows up in your
canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, totally. It's like your life is falling apart. Here's a book.
But honestly, that like I realized a lot of my life I had really prioritized kind of like a sense of safety and feeling okay. And that wasn't really focusing on that wasn't really working. Like I was missing out on a lot by just trying to like make it, by just like scrape by.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And so all this is going on. And then your dad passes. But that's kind of a bigger story. So I definitely, I don't want to just minimize it by saying it like that. It was definitely the way that you described it to me, kind of, you were in it, which is very, I mean, I don't want to say it's very similar, but, like that's how it was with my grandpa. I was there the last 2 weeks of his life and kind of was there for a lot of not so fun aspects. So yeah, so let's get into that.
Yeah. Totally.
And, how that whole thing went with the knowledge of all these other aspects of your life falling, well, not just your life, the world too, kind of falling apart.
Yeah, too. I mean, there's a total grieving process in just like the normal things, the routines that we depended on for social
sanity.
Interaction and just like keeping engaged. A lot of that stuff is just like, nope, all of a sudden it's off the table. Yeah. Which was a wild experience. And for me, I was like, okay, I kind of was at the point where my life is kind of already falling apart. So I'm just going to roll with it and
you're
like
riding
learn
the wave.
what I can. But yeah, I found out my dad was like, it was an interesting experience because my dad was minimizing what he was going through. And my mom, I thought, was like exaggerating it. Which
is hard.
Which is really hard to figure out.
Somewhere maybe in the middle.
And they're in Kansas City and I'm in Portland.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I don't really know what's going on. But then I get a picture of him without a shirt on and I'm like, oh shit, this is for real. And that was when I decided, okay, I got to get back home. And yeah, it was really, I feel really lucky. Like, I mean, I don't know if I would have been able to take off the time of work that I was able to, like if I was employed. So like, I really came in like a week to the date, like before he passed and, was able to help my mom out with just taking care of another human who's on their deathbed is not just like emotionally draining or spiritually draining, but like physically draining as well. And so I like, once I got there, she took her first shower she had for like
she was probably so
days.
pumped.
And so that was a really like magical experience being that close with them and seeing them interact, seeing my dad talking, being able to talk with him about, what happens when we die. And yeah, it was just a really beautiful and intimate experience that honestly, just like a lot of people during that time period did not have the like luxury of even experiencing. Cause I mean, I've heard so many stories about having to say goodbye, through the glass of a hospital room. And that just like it's like a heartbreaking story. So feel thankful that my dad was able to get, it was clear he was in hospice. So he was able to get transferred to the living room and set up and And yeah, but it was really interesting because already I could tell that things were different with him, and just like spiritually, like there was this love and acceptance that was like radiating off of him. And
That's awesome.
He was only 60 when he passed, so it was pretty early, but he lived a really full life, like being a musician, going on tour, he was jumping around on stage like until the pandemic happened and everything shut down. So yeah, it was just a really special experience and a really intimate one. And even the burial.
I was going to say, I definitely wanted you to tell this story because I thought it's hard to say that, like, I want to say it's cool, but it seems very well, and I think this is part of the conversation that we're going to have a bit about grief and things to say and things not to say. And that's one of those things where I'm like, I want to say it's cool because I think it seemed like a very amazing experience it seemed like one of the better experiences that you could have in a really shitty experience. And so by just saying, oh, it's a really cool story or whatever, like, I don't want to minimize or like, sound insensitive. And I think that's exactly what we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I definitely wanted you to share this story because I loved hearing it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was a very hands-on experience from beginning to end. It was like I was making him I made him his last meal. I had made like this potato and kale soup, and just like taking care of him and seeing him interact with my mom was just like really, really wild. But so like after he passed, we had a moment where all the siblings, me and my two younger siblings, were at the house at the time that he passed, and all went up and kind of just like had our moment of being like, okay, well, here we are. This has happened.
Yeah.
And so we did the entire burial ourselves, which meant that somebody had to go to Hy-Vee at 10 p.m. at night and grab blocks of dried ice to like bring back to put my dead father on blocks of ice. So we had the visitation in our living room the next morning, and then packed him up in the minivan and drove him ourselves like across, to the middle of Missouri, where there's land that my mom has done like women's retreats on, but there's also a burial ground there. So it was driving him there. Then the women in that community, they kind of like anointed him, he had like, oils and stuff and a shroud and everything. And it was literally like, I mean, this had all happened pretty fast. And so this was like, okay, we're going to do our own burial ceremony, which involved me jumping in the actual grave site. Like we had put a bunch of like cedar bows and stuff down, but it's like me jumping down with his friend and like lifting him down into the grave. So it was like a pretty surreal experience. And I mean, I'm curious about what you think was cool about it. Cause like I feel what you're saying. To me, it was like really intimate. And so the meaning of it was just really potent. Cause I feel like a lot of times, I actually just went to a funeral on Tuesday, and a lot of times it's just very removed. Like people are pumped full of chemicals. They've got a bunch of makeup on, just as like this, what feels to me kind of grasping onto this avatar of like who they were. Whereas like, it's really hard to deny what's going on when you're jumping into a grave and like lifting your father.
Yeah.
But it also felt really connected to like the cycle of life, and really like the death of my dad is what inspired me. I mean, it inspired these spiritual changes, but also just like inspired me to heal my relationship with men in general. Cause yeah, it was always a tough one. And like he did his best, and also just like he was able to show me that show his love in a way that was like, that he had never been able to show. And just, I was pretty agnostic / atheist at that point, and very just like science this, and just like not very open to thinking about this like interconnection between us all too much. And just as I began to realize that him passing away was not the ending of our relationship at all, but the beginning of a new chapter in how we interacted with each other. Because really, there's this idea of belief, of like, oh, I believe in this or that. And belief implies that you have doubt.
Yeah.
You have to have doubt to be able to believe something. But to me, it's like having a direct experience with him in that other form. The best way I can describe it is like, I began to kind of like have conversations with him and write letters to him. And, one of the heartbreaking things about grief is that you don't just lose somebody once, but multiple times. Every time, my daughter has an accomplishment, or I have an accomplishment that I want to share, it's like, oof, I can't share it with him. And, sometimes I still get that like, oh yeah, let's call dad up and be like, oh yeah, that's like,
can't do that.
Not in this reality.
Yeah.
So, and I think that there is a way to communicate, I believe. Like the best way I can describe it is when I was experimenting with talking to him, it's like, I'm sure most listeners have experienced this when you're thinking about a friend or whatever, and then boom, seconds later, they're calling you on the phone. It was like that sense where it was like me reaching out, and I could feel like there was something reaching back.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to jump back for 1 second.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back to here, but because I just want to make sure I answered your question about the coolness factor.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think you already kind of nailed it. I think it's the intimacy of it that I think is fascinating, because exactly like you said, and I've said it on the show before, even once death happens, we still don't really want to talk about it and deal with it. Like you're saying, you went to a funeral and it's still kind of like, it's still kind of pushed back. Like, I think, okay, if we're going to see the person, they're going to be all made up, and we're going to try to make them look, like they're still alive in a way. And so I think the thing that I found fascinating about it is, I think that's more closely your experience is how I'd want to go. I think for a long time, I always wanted to be cremated. But I think as I've thought about it more, it just seems like, I definitely don't want to be done up in makeup and all that stuff. And I don't want to necessarily be put into a box, whatever. But it's like, I do think some sort of green burial or, some experience like that is more natural and just probably what was meant to happen. So I just wanted to make sure I answered that because
totally.
Because I think there's so much of it that is just the way that it's done in a lot of cases is behind closed doors, and like, I love that you had, even though in this really hard experience, you had this intimate experience with your dad. I wanted to make sure I answered that for you. It didn't get left, but
sure. Thanks.
But so as we're starting to talk into jumping back to where you were at, kind of starting to get into grief a little bit, because that is a hard thing. And I think we were talking about it a little bit at the beginning. In this podcast, I've kind of talked about grief a little bit, but I think this was exciting when you and I were chatting, because this was kind of the idea that we had, at least, was that you could talk about how to talk about it, because you even mentioned like people don't know what to say. People avoid that, people dance around it. And so I think talking about your experience with grief, and then also maybe how people have communicated with you in a healthy way around grief. And I think, Ryan, our friend who has been on the podcast, this isn't necessarily around grief, but I remember I was having a particularly hard day. And I don't even remember exactly what he said, but it was something like, how can I support you right now? Mm-hmm. And it was just a weird question in the sense of I had never been asked that before, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. And so I think that is, some of the stuff that around grief that might help people bridge the gap with others.
Beautiful.
So I would love to hear kind of your experience. And I know, I'd love to hear your experience about grief. It's a huge topic, but
it actually comes back to the Pima Chadron book a little bit, and like being able to sit with discomfort. So like I believe the reason why people are so resistant to talk about these things is because it directly forces you to confront your fears around said things. So it's like we're projecting on each other constantly all the time.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if I see somebody who's suffering, it's like, rather than sitting with them in their suffering, I'm going to just try to fix the situation or like tell a joke, or I'm like, that to me feels worse because it's like, you're not really meeting me where I'm at.
Yeah.
And like, we have this obsession with like, oh, I want to make sure that I have the right things to say, or like, and really to me, it comes down to being able to hold space, like listening and presence, and like really be able to meet somebody where they're at without trying to change.
I was going to say
where they're at.
We're not going to have a conversation. Say you're having a particularly hard day thinking about your dad. I'm not going to come in and change your grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's not something that I can say, I'm going to fix this for you. And I think we are a culture of fixing things. It's like, oh, it's either fixing or masking, and so it's like, here's the solution. Don't think about it. And it's like, well, that's not a solution. So I think you're totally spot on, is just listening.
Just listening and holding space and being like, I mean, like what Ryan said to you is like, hey, I just want to let you know I'm here for you. Like, if not even sometimes what do you need can be a like overwhelming question for somebody who's not used to receiving, which a lot of men have problems with, like being able to receive help, for example. But it's just it's a tricky one.
It's very tricky. And, it's not something, again, I've basically lost 3 of my grandparents. And so I don't want to say that like I'm not sad about it, but it was like, and maybe it makes me sound callous, I'm like, it was their time to go. They were old. That sounds not great, but I mean, my grandpa that I was really close with, when he died, and that's the one that I kind of was with for the 2 weeks before he passed, it was very hard. It was very sad. But I was like, he was an alcoholic and smoked for like 50 years. And so there was an aspect of it too that I was like, well,
had a pretty good run.
Yeah. It's like, in some ways, I'm like, I'm amazed that he made it this long.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't necessarily feel like, at least, and I think whether it makes the final cut of our, conversation beforehand, I have grief in other ways, like the little deaths that we were talking about. But in the capacity that we're talking about with your dad, I don't necessarily have anything to compare that to. And I think that also is maybe not for most people, but I think that also is an aspect for people, is I can't relate on the same level. I haven't lost a parent. And so how do I, and it's the same answer, right? But I think that's also a hang up for people, is like, I can't relate. I can't help fix this problem because I haven't dealt with this problem. And so now I'm sorry. I hope, pat on the back, totally. That kind of feels like what happens a lot of the time.
No, also apologizing is like, well, it's not really like that person's, that's not like it really had.
Are you the one who did it?
Yeah, exactly.
I've been looking for you.
But yeah, I think there is this almost like default where like more is better. But like, as you're talking about, there is an appropriateness to like, okay, like when somebody has lived a full or long life, that it's kind of like, okay, this is something that is a natural part of, like, it would be weirder if he kept on going.
It would be really weird if he was still around.
And I feel similar about, like, my dad had pulmonary fibrosis. So like we would have had to catch it, like 8 years before he passed, and he would have had to have a lung transplant and all this stuff. But even though it was unexpected, I could see that he was suffering a lot.
Yeah.
Like he would have these dreams of running. Like he was a track star. So he'd have these dreams where he's like running through these fields and just like then waking up to this is somebody who's very physically active and like kept good care of his body. He was, did a lot of, music stuff, but also just he and my mom did a bunch of yoga, walked around, just like they kept active. So just seeing that, that is its own grieving process of like seeing somebody who was literally like a god to you at one point, get to this point of like, kind of like decrepit, wasting away. And that was really hard, and also a big wake up call for like, oh, like daddy's not going to save me anymore. And like, oh, that means who's next in line? It turns out that I'm responsible for my own life, which is like a rough wake up call. And I think it's like totally healthy and a natural part of life. So that's the other piece, is I think that there's more people experiencing this than we think, but because it's like quiet, it's like taboo. We've got to keep quiet about it. We don't really know. And that can create this sense of isolation of like, oh, well, I'm the only one who's like dealing with this, when it's like, what is a more universal experience than death?
Yeah. And I think it might have been when we talked last, but there's also the aspect of like, the quietness around it is like, well, you don't want to talk about your dad because it's going to make you sad. And I feel like and again, it might have been from our conversation, but from other people I've talked to, it's like, no, I actually want to talk about them. Mm-hmm. Like I want more people to know about this person who made such an impact on my life. And then that becomes this like clash of, I'm afraid to bring it up. And you're like, please bring it up,
Yeah.
Which, just creates this like tension.
I think also there's like a consent component that can be helpful too, with like, hey man, like, are you okay if I ask you some questions? Like, do you want to talk, because it's like, I'm to the point where I'm, like 4 years out of this. And so I have a perspective that's different than like when I was like in the very much thick of it.
Hey, I've broken down the last 3 days and I just want a day off. Today I've done a really good job of distracting myself. Maybe ask me next week. So I think that's also a good point, is where you are at in the process. Yeah. And that's different for each person.
But for me now, like I feel like it's a celebration of his memory and like who he was and how he affected people and like the music that he brought to the world. And so for me now, it feels like even the talking about him and celebrating him is one thing, but also even grieving about him. I feel like grieving to me is nourishing, not only to me because it's honoring what is actually happening in my experience, but it's also nourishing to him because there's less ways that I know how to honor his memory and honor our relationship. But grief is it to me. There's this quote that is, grief is love with nowhere to go. And when I first heard this and I was grieving, I was like, oh, this is heavy. This is like kind of making me feel more depressed.
Yeah.
And I realized that that's not really how it works. Like, I feel like grief is an expression of love, and it's grief because they're not here in physical form and there's loss there. But to me, the love, like expressing love to them, is the same thing as expressing like grief, because you wouldn't be crying if they didn't mean a lot to you.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, people do this with breakups too, where they're like, oh, well, how can I just minimize the amount of pain that I have to go through? But it's like, if you really want to minimize the pain that you want to go through, the best thing is to throw out that framework completely and turn towards the stuff that is scaring the hell out of you, and learn how to sit in it with like this determination, but also with like grace and compassion and love. Like, I feel like that piece is a really important part.
Yeah. My therapist has been telling me, don't waste this. You know, when you're going through hard stuff, don't waste this. This is important. Okay. So now we've kind of talked about it and danced around it a little bit. I think you mentioned that you maybe not were agnostic, atheist type. And I'm actually going to kind of give you like a multi-question with this, because you said, you know, on your dad's kind of deathbed, you kind of got to hear about what his beliefs were about death. And, you know, the big question is, you know, what do you think happens when we die? Mm-hmm. So it's, what did your dad think? Did that change what you think? And what do you think happens when we die?
Yeah, totally.
And I think that's probably a blob of just stuff around it. But I have a feeling that those kind of play a part in each other a little bit in your life.
Definitely. Yeah. So this is like a big piece of it all for me. And, you know, have always been like open and curious, but also kind of like pessimistic at the same time. And just as I was witnessing these changes in just like how he held himself, and just watching him kind of like on his way to transition, which is a whole other, it's like, where he's not 100% there right now. Like, yeah, so I ended up asking him that very question, like, hey, Dad, what do you think happens? And he's got the respirator on. So he's writing out on this whiteboard, and he writes, I become a part of the unified field, and I'm everywhere you are. And that was just like, holy, like this was a different level of my dad that I had never met before. Like, my dad was a big goofball and trickster energy, hard worker, but just like, this was like, felt like my entire universe just changed in that moment. And it really helped me feel connected to him after he was gone in physical form, you know, and my mom and him were together since they were 16. And he would tell her that, like, anytime you see the sun rays, like, coming through the clouds, that's me, like, peeking around to say hi. And so there's just like this sense of connection. I mean, like I was talking about earlier, where it became less of an intellectual, like, oh, I wonder what this happens, and more of a direct felt experience. And that was when I was like, well, okay, I don't really, like, people we can debate and talk about it, but like I was talking about earlier, like, belief is different than knowing.
Yeah.
And knowing and having a direct relationship with my dad and with spirit or the unified field or whatever you want to call it, like, that totally just shifted. And when I realized, oh, like, I don't need to go through an intermediary or anything like that, where it's like, if I want to talk to my dad, I can write him a letter. Sometimes he like I'll be playing music and then these chords will just like come out of nowhere. I'm like, okay, thanks, Dad. So it's like, I don't give a shit about convincing anybody about anything because I know what is true for me. And so,
and that's all that matters.
That's enough. Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah, totally.
And I feel like I'm going to keep on repeating this over and over and over again, but like, that's what I'm trying to do here is find what I believe and can accept, because I think that makes things easier at the end. Or I choose to believe that it will, that I'd rather say, hey, you know what? This is what I believe and I accept it. And I feel like that will make death easier.
Totally.
But who knows? That could not be true, but I would rather go on that journey than not and come to the end and be like panicked.
To me, the other thing that really came with that awareness is the sense of like responsibility of legacy, of like, okay, what is legacy? Is it the songs that we write? Is it, it's like, yes.
And we talked about this a little bit too. Yeah.
Is it like how we treat people? Hell yes.
Yeah.
And just that served as a catalyst for me being able to look at legacy in a totally different way, because I'm like, okay, what parts of my dad have been passed on to me? And it's like, there's a person. So I don't know if you know internal family systems and that, like psychology, but it's basically like the premise that we have inner childs in there. We have multiple different characters that are in this, what we call the self. And so it's like, even with my dad physically gone, there is a part of him inside me that lives on through the memories and experiences that we have together. And just like from a purely psychological level, like we contain holographs of other people like inside of that become, different parts of our psyche, essentially. Yeah. So being able to like, oh yeah, so the sense of him being gone, yes, he's gone, but also that dialogue is still happening all the time. And how can I become aware of what that dialogue is? So it's not like repeating past patterns or past versions of myself that I don't want to repeat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think because in the first episode when I did mine, I had my very like aggressive, legacy's a lie. And I think when we talked about, you might have just commented on that post. And I think you got more to the heart of it, where I think a lot of people think of materialistic and accomplishment type of legacy. And I think, what you're talking about, just the energy that we put forward to other people and, the way that we carry ourselves, those are vastly different things.
Yeah.
And so, maybe I need to be less aggressive and more clear with my wording.
It's like,
but
when we're talking about dharma, purpose in the Western world, it gets reduced like many things do to what is your current job?
Yeah.
Like, that is it's like a speck of sand on a beach. It's like, I mean, your role as a dog dad is as important as like whatever you happen to be doing in your career. Like, it's my belief that also just like the effect that we have on other humans and how we interact and like how we navigate our experience that's like spiritual importance to me.
Yeah. I always hate that question of like, well, what do you do for a living? And it's like, I'm a photographer, but that's not who I am. That's just something that I do. Yeah. Even though that is an art form, it should be an expression of who I am. I think once it becomes a career, it's a little bit different, but that's like, as you said earlier, that's another podcast.
That's fine.
Okay. So then the last one, which everybody always thinks this is the hardest question. What would you want to tell people you would be leaving behind if you died tomorrow?
Yeah, that is it. That's a tricky one because I actually have stuff that I want to do before that happens. But yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it with my daughter, like she's an amazing cook. She has a strong tie to her like ancestral, like on her mom's side, especially, but like she loves cooking food from like other cultures. And she's been experimenting with like Eastern European food, especially. But it's also just like how my daughter treats other people, you know, like that's a reflection of how I have treated her throughout. And it's like when we're talking about legacy, it's inclusive. It's not like, oh, we'll pick and choose here or there, but it's like literally all of the interactions. And so I think sometimes it's even hard to really quantify or talk about because it seems like such a vast thing to me. It's like less about like what we were talking about, the physical accomplishments or like the job, you know, application style of like, this is my life in a job application form.
Yeah, totally.
And more about like what energy did you bring and how does that ripple out into future generations? And to me too, there's an interesting thing with just like how we experience time as well. And being like, okay, well, this is like how we experience time, but that doesn't appear to be how time actually works too. Yeah. So it's like,
because time and to some extent is a human construct.
And
you know, like there is an aspect of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also like our human created time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, like, I think essentially what you're saying is those two don't necessarily match up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think the other one, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the one that I might leave, you know, this conversation thinking, you know, if I died tomorrow, one thing that, you know, I'd want my family and stuff to know is you can still talk to me.
Mm.
You can write me letters.
Mm-hmm.
You can, you know, go on a walk, you know, and these things, and you can still communicate with me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the things that we've talked about. We talked about it a little bit today, but we've talked about in the past how that's helped you with your grief so much is you still feel like you can communicate with your dad.
Yeah, too. And I think part of it too is like that doesn't happen on accident. Like it's an intentional thing. Like his birthday's coming up on the 4th of January here. And so it's like every year on his birthday, I write him a letter every, you know, generally like on the anniversary of when he passes, it's like a way to keep that relationship alive because it is something that's like the ball is in my court, so to speak, where it's like if I want to be kicked back, I've got to throw it first, you know. Yeah. And there are moments where it's like where it comes in and where I'm open to it, or I'm like, okay, cool. Hi, Dad, or like a light turns on. I love it when that kind of stuff happens, or it's like a light turns on randomly. I'm like, okay. But yeah,
that's awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you. Well, I appreciate you, and I thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah.
How can people find you? You're doing some cool work in Portland.
Yeah, I'm a part of a few different men's groups at the moment. So I'm actually starting one on my own that'll be launching like later in January,
which should coincide fairly closely to when this will release.
Okay, cool.
So we can definitely add that to the show notes.
Yeah, and there's also you can find me on Instagram. I am Zac Phillips on Instagram.
Yeah, this is a double Zac episode.
yeah, totally. Totally. But yeah, and I also have a website, zacphillips.com, that has my better description of like my offerings and group. I mean, I work mainly with groups of men. And yeah, actually, I mean, if you don't mind, yeah, we could go into that because that's actually
you should talk about it.
Been a big piece of my own healing journey because I think part of what we're missing is like a communal sharing and communal witnessing of what is going on. And So we kind of like, it's like we go on social media and share the absolute, top of the iceberg. And then so much depth is just lost.
Yeah.
But it's like death is a universal thing. Suffering is a universal thing. And like, why not learn how to release those emotions? Like toxicity, to me, there's all this talk about toxic masculinity. And to me, toxicity is just stuckness. So it's emotion that's in there that wants to come out that doesn't know how. And a lot of people, but especially men, have a hard time with knowing how to share in a healthy way. And honestly, just finding spaces where that is welcome to be able to share in that way. So yeah, for me, it was like my dad's passing came with a realization that I had really mainly had a bunch of female friendships and like not a lot of male friendships throughout my entire life. And so part of the healing of the grieving process was also like joining this men's group and learning how to like trust men, learning how to trust the like masculine side of myself, but also I had been in therapy, for anxiety and depression before. And I had found that while it gave me like a bird's eye view of like how my psyche worked, that it wasn't really getting me to where I wanted to go in terms of like movement and changing things. And it was almost just like, okay, I'll go in and then tell the story of how these people hurt me and then do it the same the next week.
Yeah.
But what really began to shift is being able to be seen by others in a group where the culture is around creating a safe space for sharing and being able to see other people who are going through stuff. I think there's this tendency, at least that I had when I was grieving, to be like, oh, well, I'm clearly the only person who's going through this. And there's this isolation. Like, I don't want to like be a burden on anybody else or whatnot. But that really helped realize like, oh, other people are going through things and trying to improve their lives and worrying about
Which is
this
so
and
hard
that.
to see sometimes, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah,
like
totally.
We're all in our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're so focused in on that. And so like not only being able to be witnessed, like that was a healing thing in a community way, but also being able to witness other people in their experience and what was going on. And yeah, just like I think that is one of the best ways to like handle grief, because there's no way
it's like
to,
not trying to be too on the nose, but it really loops back into holding space. And
oh yeah, totally. Because it's like it's a practice. That's the other thing, is it's like we don't learn how to do this overnight, and there's going to be some fuck ups, and that's okay. Even if you're like trying to hold space for a friend who's grieving and like really try to be there, and even if there's something that's like you mess up, I guarantee it's better than like avoiding it.
Or trying to, hey, let's talk about something else. Let's avoid your feelings. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I hope that people check you out and go to some of the men's group. I know I need to get on it. The last one, do you have that? I can't remember if it's a quote or a poem. Do you want to finish off reading that?
So this is a poem by Glenn Flowers. I had my own notion of grief. I thought that it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new dimension of self.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of When We Die Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked some thoughts and helped you feel a little more at ease with the idea of death. Remember, this journey is all about exploring our beliefs and fears together, so I'd love to hear from you. Call our voicemail at 971-328-0864 and share what you think happens when we die. Your thoughts might just be featured on a future episode and could help others on their own journey. Until next time, have a good life.